Bernadine, I want to start with Girl, Woman, Other and talk about the fact that there's 12 very different black women in that book from different backgrounds. I want to know how conscious a decision was it to make those backgrounds so different and so diverse?
That was the point of the book, in a sense. I just wanted to explore a big range of black British womanhood as much as I could within the scope of a single novel, because I wanted to, if you like, say to the world, we are all things and everythings, we are many things. It's the opposite of a stereotype, and it's the opposite of being absent. So I made sure that they were a huge range of ages. They're aged 19 to 93. They come from different cultural backgrounds, from the Caribbean, from Africa. Quite a lot of them are born in the UK, which was also really important. They're different sexualities, classes, occupations, preoccupations, family setups, just a range. It was really about exploring a multiplicity of black British womanhood in this country.
Indeed, and why is it important to you to have black women represented in this way? Why is it important for black women out there that they see themselves in your art?
Yes, that's a rhetorical question, isn't it? Because we're not really very present in British literature, and this has been an ongoing problem for decades. And so it's quite unusual to come across a contemporary novel about black British women. We are around writers, and some of us are writing about black women's experiences, but there aren't many of us. I know everybody who is writing about black British women at the moment. I can tell you that those women, I can count them on two hands. So that really is a very limited representation of who we are, considering thousands of novels are published every year. So it's so important that we are included in every aspect of this society, and that we feel that we're equal to everybody else, and that the society values our creativity, how we choose to write our stories, but who we choose to write about.
What would the women in that book, how would they react to today's events?
Um, Amma would be talking about how she used to demonstrate in the 80s, and telling her daughter Yaz, who's 19, to go on the demonstration because she would consider herself a higher risk because she's in her late 50s. Yaz would be there, she'd be there with a megaphone, having her say, and absolutely enjoying the moment, as in a sense that kind of the community that people have when they have on protests, solidarity, that's the word, that feeling of solidarity. Yaz would absolutely love that. You've got Carol, who's the banker, who's very uptight. Carol will be looking at it from a distance, and she would not be engaging with the idea of Black Lives Matter. Even though she's somebody who would really benefit from it. She's somebody who sold her soul to the corporate world, and she would not want to be seen as a troublemaker in that environment. And then you have Winsome, who is of the Windrush generation, who now lives in the Caribbean, and she'd be very upset at what's happening. She'd be thinking that nothing's changed from when she first came to the UK in the 50s. And of course, lots has changed, but she would be very emotionally upset by what happened with George Floyd and just the whole kind of racial dynamic that sometimes feels like it hasn't moved forwards.
I don't know how much you've been across the recent events of the last kind of 10 days, 2 weeks, so a lot of the killings of people in America and in the UK, but predominantly in the US. What are your thoughts on what's happening? And how do you feel, as a black woman, how do you feel when you see these videos, see the reporting? As a black person, how do you feel?
I think, like a lot of people, I'm really outraged at what's happened. And I also think it shines a spotlight on this country. So we're used to looking at the sort of macro kind of racism that exists in America and the atrocities that happen there. And we often overlook the more pernicious racism that happens in this country, as well as atrocities. We know that black people in this country have been killed by the police. We know that there is a disproportionate number of black people, in particular black men, in prison. We know that we are living in a very racist society, but there is a certain level of complacency in Britain, and often people just don't seem to get those kinds of mainstream platforms to talk about the reality of what it's like to be black in this society. At the same time, the people who are in the establishment, so to speak, the people who are running the institutions, often do not take the lead in addressing the iniquities in this society. So it feels like unless we, people of colour, are shouting and screaming about what we see as discrimination in our society, nothing is ever done about it. And even when we do protest, nothing is ever done about it. So nobody ever talks about it unless we bring it up. But at the same time, when you talk about racism in the UK, it's not just about us apportioning blame or looking to the institutions to change. It also has to be about us taking responsibility when and where we can. And it has to be a two-way thing. And sometimes I feel that the conversation is one of attacking and not taking responsibility. But when we do take responsibility and we still get knocked back, that's when there's a problem.
What do you mean by taking responsibility?
In our communities, in our families, we have to do the best that we can do in order to achieve in this society. And do we? We have to ask ourselves, are we making that possible? You know, taking responsibility is also taking ownership, and it's also empowering, because you're saying to yourself, what is it that I can do to make myself or to make my family or to make my people more equal partners in this society that we're in?
I'm sensing, or I'm guessing from that you don't feel that we are in a moment of change here. There's a lot of, hashtagging, there's a lot of Black Lives Matter and all that sort of stuff, but in 6 months' time, do you feel that this will just be another news cycle?
We'll see. I think there will be some degree of change, but probably not the change that we really need. We know that the media jumps onto what's current. It's all about what's current, and the whole idea of Black Lives Matter is fashionable at the moment, but it was fashionable a few years ago as well. What I find really hopeful is that people are curating reading lists, and I think I cannot underestimate the value of reading for so many reasons, but people want to educate themselves on what it's like to be a person of colour in this society, and so they're curating these reading lists, and people are saying that they are actively going to seek out these books and read them. And I think if you're going to read any number of Black British books, fiction, non-fiction, poetry, that have been published in the last 2 years, you are going to be a changed person at the end of that. Let's say you're going to read 10 of these books. You are going to be a changed person at the end of that if you're not going to approach the book approach the work just to argue with it.
What would you like Britain and the authorities and the governing bodies of this country and the government to do now to show that they're not just talking the talk, they're walking the walk?
Everybody needs to have a plan of action, right, about what they can do to change the inequalities in our society. So instead of not taking responsibility, instead of pleading innocence or ignorance, which is what we encounter when we often talk about race, people need to take responsibility. They need to look at themselves, so they need to look at themselves, they need to look at their organisations, and then they need to see where they stand in terms of inclusivity and diversity, and then they need to implement a plan of action, right? And that goes from the individual to the big corporation. That's how we're going to see change. And that plan of action needs to include bringing people in to the top of the hierarchy, people into positions of power, right? So we need to be in the boardrooms. We need to be in the newsroom. We need to be in the university professoriate. We need to be in positions of power. And the argument that we're not good enough is nonsense, in my experience, because I've seen how this society operates. People are tribal. They like to be around people they think are like themselves. And when you're coming from another culture, or they think you're coming from another culture because your skin is different, you're not seen as relatable. You're not seen as the kind of person that they might want to work with. people are very tribal. And so that works against people of colour in this society. And even though I was born here, I grew up with fish fingers, fish and chips, all those terrible 70s sitcoms. You know, my culture is deeply British, right? Simply because visually I look different, I'm going to be treated differently by this society. You know, simply by that.